Today we will recreate the Instagram login page only using HTML and CSS. And as you can see, this page is also fully responsive, so once you resize the page, everything will adapt according to the screen size and look good on pretty much every single device, and this will look exactly the same as the original Instagram page. We're going to start with an HTML file and a CSS file, and inside of this HTML file we first have to link our CSS file by using link:/CSS, and now we have linked our style.css file to our index.html file. If we take a look at the original page, you can see an image to the left and a login form to the right, as well as a footer to the bottom. So for this section we need to use a flexbox or a grid, whatever you prefer, but in our case we're going to use a flexbox. So we create two wrapper divs, one wrapper div for the image and another wrapper div for the login form. So inside of our body, we will say that we will have a main section, for example, and right here we will have a div, and we are going to duplicate this div, so we have two divs, and the first div is basically our image div, and the second one is the div for our login form, basically. So let's start to use the image first of all. So we are going to use an image tag, and we will say this one points to our images folder and points to our Insta Pro PNG image. So this image basically. And how do you get this image? You can, for example, so it's actually pretty easy. If you want to use the exact same image, you can just go ahead and copy this image, for example. And you can, for example, use this icon, so search by image. You paste your image in here, and now it searches for the exact same image. And as you can see, we have this result here, for example. This is already in PNG. So you can just download this image, so save it to your PC, and now you have the exact same image. And obviously you could, for example, do the same for the icon right here, so for the Instagram logo. So that being said, let's go ahead. We now have this image, and now let's also create the login div. So first of all, we need this icon to the top, then we need two input fields, then we need a button, and then we need those things right here. So let's start by implementing our image. So let's say image, and this one points to our images folder as well, but this one goes to Instagram text icon.webpack. Right below, we should have this input field. So now we will create two input fields. So let's say input : and this one will have a type of text, and this one will basically say email minus username minus phone, because you can basically enter email, username or phone, and this one will have the exact same ID. And as a placeholder we'll say phone number, username or email. So let's go ahead and say placeholder phone number, username or email. And now we're going to create an input field of type password with the name password, the ID of password, and the placeholder of password. Next up, we need to create a button. So we'll say button of type submit, and actually we'll put all of this inside of a form as a wrapper. So we'll say form, we go in there, and for this button we basically say log in. So let's just write log in right here. So now we should also have this button as well as the input fields. Right below the button we basically have one div that has a border, then we have this OR, and we have another div that also should have a border. So what we can do is we can use another wrapper div right here. Instead of this wrapper div, we use one div and another div, and right below we use a paragraph, and this paragraph says OR, for example. So this here will be one line, this here will be one line, and this here will be the OR. Then we also want to use this login with Facebook section. So again, we need another div, and I give this one a comment of OR section, and right below I use Facebook login, and here we create another div. Here we need an image, so basically an icon, as well as a paragraph or an anchor tag. And for this anchor tag we say login with Facebook. Now we also need this Facebook SVG, so we're going to go and search for free SVG images. Right here you can go to SVG repo, for example, and we can just go ahead and basically search for Facebook. So we'll find a Facebook icon like this one, for example, and this one looks exactly the same like the one we've used for Instagram. We're going to download this one, it's an SVG file as you can see, and we're going to drag this one inside of our images folder. Right here we are going to right click and say open with, and we will use the text editor because we want to use this as an SVG image. So right below this anchor tag we can import this one as an SVG image, and we will already set the width to only 20 pixels, for example, and the height to 20 pixels as well. So now we have this effect. Obviously this is probably a little bit too low, so we'll say 40 pixels, and now this looks pretty good. But the original one probably only uses 30 and 30. Next up, we have this forgot password section, so we'll create that one next. So we'll say, right below this Facebook login div, we will have an anchor tag that says forgot password ? And next up, we can create another paragraph that includes this text right here. So we'll go right below, we will create this paragraph, and inside of this paragraph we want to have a clickable part. This report content you believe is awful should be clickable. So we'll put this here inside of an anchor tag, and this is going to look like this. And right below we have this don't have an account sign up section. So we will say those are paragraphs, for example, and right below we say go to register, and right here we will have another paragraph, don't have an account yet, and we need to put this sign up, for example, inside of an anchor tag, and we will put both of these tags inside of a div because we need to put them inside of a flex box. And as you can see, now we should have both of our sections, but they're obviously looking completely terrible. So we have to start to style them, and I will create some basic styles. So in our style shield, first of all, we will use the universal selector and say margin of 0 for everything, padding of 0 for everything, and box minus sizing for everything. And those are just default settings that you should always have for your website. Next up, we are going to define a class that says .flex basically and sets display to flex. We'll also create a class .gap-1 that has a gap of 10 pixels. And now we can start to use those classes already to create some of the basic styles. So we are going to say, for example, for go to register, we will say class of flex, for example. And as you can see, now we have this don't have an account sign up next to each other. We can also say we want to have a gap of 1. So now we have a little gap. But actually, I'm also going to define .gap.05 for a gap of 5 pixels, because between most of those texts, 5 pixels might be a little bit better. And as you can see, now we have this gap. Then we also want to have this login with Facebook next to this Facebook button. So we're also going to define .items-center, and this one will have align items of center. So we're going to go right in here, and we obviously also need to put this SVG right above our anchor tag. Now we'll give this repetitive a class of flex and a gap of 0.5, for example. So we have this effect and items-center. And now as you can see, those items are centered and aligned next to each other. I want those columns to be aligned vertically, so we're going to add a class of .flex-column, and we will set display or flex direction to column. So now we can use flex column to create a display of column, and we're going to use this one right here inside of our input section. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to put those items right here inside of another repetitive, and we will give this repetitive a class of flex and flex-column, for example. So now those items are aligned vertically, as you can see. Next up, I think it might make a little more sense to also give our image, or let's go into the full screen mode to really see what's going on. So now inside of our full screen mode, you can see that this is basically what's going on. And this looks absolutely terrible, and especially this image needs to be a lot smaller. So we'll give this one a class of logo, for example, and we'll say that our .logo class has a width, for example, of let's say 300 pixels. And actually I think we used the class for the wrong one, so this should basically be this image right here. So now we have this effect, and this looks a lot better already. So as you can see, now we have this image to the left and this image to the right, or at least we want to have it like that. So we will put everything inside of a repetitive once again. So we'll just grab everything, delete it, create a div, and put it in there. And now we will give this div a class of flex because we want to have them next to each other, as you can see, like this. And now what we can do next is we can also say that we want to create a class of .justify-center. So we'll say justify center is equal to justify content of center. Now we will use this class and this class to align all of our items in this flex box in the center. So we'll say justify center, items-center. So now everything is centered, but obviously this also needs to take up at least 100% of the available viewport height. So this really makes sense. But in order to do so, we will just say that our main section, for example, so let's target main, will have a min minus height of 100 viewport height, like so. And now let's create the class of dot grow minus 1, and we will set flex grow to 1. So this takes up all of the available space. So we are going to give this class to this flex box basically. And we will give our main class of flex. And now this column is basically able to take up all of the available space. So this section here basically. Next up, as you can see, we have a lot of space right here below our logo. So actually I just created this version instead of Photoshop. So now we have this effect. So now it would also make sense for the entire right column to use justify of center and use a flex box for them. So we're going to say for this entire form, let's use class of flex justify center. So now our content should be justified, but we will also say that we want to have text minus center, and we need to create this class. So we'll go into our style sheet and say dot text center text align center. Now for this div right here, we will also say items minus center to align the items to the center. Let's also start to create the styles for our input field. So we'll say dot input, for example, and we will take a look at the original inputs on the original page. So if we right click this page, for example, and if you take a look at the background, for example, you can see that we have this background color that is basically equal to this IG secondary background. So we'll just go ahead and maybe say that our background is equal to RGB 250 to 50 to 50, and we will use this input class for our backgrounds already, for our inputs already. So we'll say class is equal to input, and the same obviously goes for the second class as well. So we'll have this class. We can obviously also just copy this font right here, and we can actually just say that we use the exact same font for the entire body to make it a little easier. And I think this is a system font anyways, so it shouldn't really matter too much. So we'll say font family is equal to this font family. So now we have this effect already. Our input fields should also take up 100% of the available width. Have a padding top bottom of maybe 10 pixels, or maybe into every single direction. Padding like so. As you can see, now it looks a lot closer already. Let's also say we want to have an outline of none once we hover over it. A border minus radius of probably 5 pixels. So now let's say 8. It looks a lot closer already. Now we also have to take a look at the border. So as you can see, they are using for this input element. So as you can see for the text right here, they are using this RGB var secondary text, so 115, 115, 115. And I think they're using the exact same color for the inputs. So we are just going to say that the color is RGB of 115, 115, and 115. So we're going to save this, take a look at our page. So we have this color. I think the border color is the exact same. So we'll say border 1 pixel solid. And we will just copy and paste this color right here. So we'll say this is the color, like so. So now we have the exact same border color. I mean, it looks slightly different, and probably they use something probably lighter. So maybe 190. Let's just test 190. They probably use something a little bit lighter, but you can also go into Photoshop and test if you wanted to. Now this looks a lot closer. Now let's take a look at our button and say, we want to get this color right here. And as you can see, if we take a look at the button, we get this IG color primary. So we need to copy those values right here. And then we are going to use this value for our dot button. So we'll create a button, and we will say this one has a background, for example, of RGB. And I think it was 7493249. So now we'll use this button class for our button. So we'll say class btn. Let's take a look at this. So we now have this background color. We also have a color of white. We will have a width of 100%, a padding of 10 pixels, a border minus radius of 8 pixels, and a border of 0. So now we get this effect. But I actually think the base color is slightly different. So what you can also do is you can just take a screenshot, go into photo editing software like Photoshop, for example, grab the color picker, for example, and then you can just copy this color code right here, and now you get the exact same color. And since we will use this color for the text later on anyways, I'm just going to go ahead and do this. So now we have this button effect. Okay, that was my bad. We actually have to use border box right here instead of 0. So now we have this effect, and now the login looks a lot better. So now I also want to have some margin to the bottom for this input field right here, so for this image basically. And as you can see, this image is also a lot smaller, so I have to fix that as well. So we're going ahead and going to say that our logo has a width of maybe 150 pixels only, so it looks like this. And we can also give this one a margin bottom of maybe 50 pixels. So now this comes a lot closer. For those input fields, we want to have a slight gap. So in order to do so, we can say that this entire form section will, or this div inside of the form section will have a gap of 1, for example. So now we have a slight gap between those items. So next up, we need to create this OR section. And as you know, this OR section should have a button. And in the center, there should be this OR. So let's go ahead. Let's say we are going to create this div right here. We will say this one has a class of flex gap -1. So now this one should be centered, actually, this or at least we are going to center it once we give this class a grow -1. And we will also use class of grow -1 for the second div. And as you can see, now our div is centered. We can give this entire div empty of 2, for example, and we don't have this class yet. So we'll say .empty -2 will have a margin top of 20 pixels. So now we have some margin. And now we'll also create .border, for example, and we'll say border top, for example, is 1 pixel. And we'll just copy this value right here that we have for our input as well. And we will use this border class for those two divs that are now right now invisible, but next to this OR basically. So we give this div a class of border and this div a class of border. And as you can see, now we have this border effect. Makes also sense to align those items. So we'll say items minus center. So we aligned them vertically. And obviously you can also increase the width of the gap if you wanted to. So this doesn't really matter. And we also have to change the size of this OR and the color of this OR. So let's define .gray, and let's say that .gray has a color of, let's maybe try this gray color right here of RGB 190. And now we'll use this gray essentially for our OR. So we'll say OR has a class of gray, so now it's gray. Or let's maybe use the darker gray of 115 by copying that one and pasting it in here. And now we also need to change the font size. So we'll say font -SM has maybe a font size of 0.8 rem. So it's a little bit smaller than the initial font size. Let's also use that one right here for the OR, and now we should have this OR effect. And as you can see, this looks really, really close to the original page already. Now we can also change this login with Facebook button. So in order to do so, let's take a look at our page. We need to center those items first of all. So let's go to the wrapper div. As you can see, let's give this one a justify of center. So now it's justified to the center. Let's also use MT3, for example. I don't think that we have that already. So we'll copy and paste that one, create MT-3 and say 30 pixels. So now we have this gap. Now we'll also need this color for this text. So first of all, we'll create a style of text minus or underline minus none. We will create text decoration of none dot bold to create font weight of bold, and we will create dot blue to create a color of blue basically, and we will just take this background color for our color right here as well, and this should essentially work already. So let's go to this Facebook icon and let's say this one here, this text gets a class of underline minus none, blue, and let's also try bold. So now we have this effect, but actually the blue color looks pretty weird to me. Yeah, because we need to use this hashtag. And now we have this effect already. And I also think that we are going to try font minus SM right here. So now we have this effect, but maybe I'm going to use font, or going to create font minus MD, which will have a font size of 0.9 rem. Now we'll use font MD right here, and now we have this effect which looks a lot closer. I'm also going to copy this color code right here and use that one for our SVG image. So we can go right here to the fill section and paste this color code in, and now we have this effect which looks pretty nice. Now we also want to style our forgot password section, so in order to do so we can again go to this password, and let's say we have class underline minus none again, font minus MD and bold. Actually, let's also put this anchor tag inside of a div, and let's give this div a class of flex and justify minus center. Now this password is centered, and let's use MT3 again for that one, or let's just use MT2. So now we have a little gap. Also, this text here looks pretty weird. I don't even know why. Actually, let's use blue for that one as well. So now we have, or let's use black to be honest. And we are going to create a class that has the name .black, and this one will have a color of essentially black. So now we have this forget password section. Right below, we want to create this section right here. So we need our gray text as well as our blue text. And this should actually be pretty easy, so we can just go ahead and say, okay, this paragraph has a class of gray, and this anchor tag has a class of blue, and underline minus none. And let's also say we just give this one another class. So right now it looks like this. The text is also a little bit too big, so we can change that by saying this one has text minus SM, or I think it was font minus SM. So now the text should be pretty small as well. And obviously we want to use the exact same font for the entire paragraph. So we'll use that one here. Now we have this effect. Let's also use text minus center. I don't know if we have this class. Yeah, we have this class that centers our text. We have a little bit of margin, and I'm going to use MT minus 3 right here. So now we have some margin, and we want to have an underline once we hover over this one. So we'll just use maybe hover, or we will create a class hover minus underline, and we will just say once we hover over this class, so dot hover underline colon hover, we will create a text decoration of underline. So now this one should work as well. As you can see, this is now underlined, so works perfectly fine. Now we also want to have don't have an account sign up, and we want to create this section. This one has a black text as well as a blue text, so we can just go here, say this one has a class of, I think the text is black anyway, so we'll give the entire wrapper a class of font minus MD to make it slightly smaller. The entire class will also have an MT of 5 or 6, for example. We need to create that, so we'll say dot MT6 will have a margin minus top of 60 pixels, like so. Maybe we will use justify center to justify the text in the center, and now we can use the class bold for that, blue for that one, and let's maybe also use underline minus none, so we get this effect. And I think, yeah, the sign up is basically also bold in the original page. So we now have this effect. And as you can see, I actually didn't even know if I opened the original Instagram page on this one, to be honest. But there's one thing missing, and it is basically our footer. So we can go ahead and create this footer right here. And actually we are going to set this min height for our entire body instead of our main section, because this probably makes a little more sense. And now we'll, right below our body, use a footer. And we'll say this footer has essentially 2 divs, one div for all of the items on the top and one for all of the items on the bottom. So let's essentially just go ahead and create a couple of paragraphs. You can, for example, say this one is meter. The second one is probably, let's save this. The second one is probably about. So you just have to copy in a lot of paragraphs that basically say the exact same as the original text. And you have to give all of them the class of gray. So I'm just going to do this, and you can obviously do this by your own. And maybe we are also going to use the font minus SM, for example, and underline minus none. So as you can see, now we have those 2 sections, and obviously they're looking terrible. So now essentially we'll wrap our main section as well as our footer section inside of another div. like so. And now we need to obviously have a flex box for both of these items. So we can say this div has a class of flex. Now they're aligned next to each other, which is obviously terrible. So we say flex column to get them in a column again. And now we want to have this main container basically take up all of the available space that is available to it. So we'll say class grow -1. So now, as you can see, this body takes up 100% of the available space, but this div right here only takes up the minimal available space, which is obviously not what we want. So obviously it would be better to use a wrapper div, but for convenience, I'm just going to say that this one has a class of flex, but yeah, usually a wrapper div would be better. And now this here can essentially grow. So we will say this here has a grow of 1 as well. And let's also give this one flex justify center item center class, so this here center as well. Now we can also say that those header icons should be centered and aligned properly. So we can first of all say we are going to create a margin on the y-axis. So we're going to say margin minus top 10 pixels, or let's say 20 pixels, margin minus bottom 20 pixels. Now we will copy this class right here. We will give this class to our entire footer essentially. So we'll say footer, let's go, is right here. Let's give this one a class my2. We are going to save this. We have this effect. Let's also say display, or let's say flex or justify center. And we're going to center the items. As you can see, we have this effect. Let's also stay with flex column because we want to have them in a column. And instead of justify center, we need to use item center because now this one is the main axis. Let's also create a gap between those items by using gap -1. And maybe also text minus center in case they are not centered. And now we can also use a slight gap between those items. Let's say this one has a class of flex, for example. Now we can say gap 0.5, for example, or let's use gap 1. So we get 10 pixels of gap between those items. And now they look a lot better in my opinion. If we take a look at the original page right here, you can see we are basically shrinking the page. And at a certain point, we just get rid of our image. So yeah, doing that is actually super easy. We're just going to create a media query and we will just say at a certain width, basically just delete this image. We'll give this one a class of display minus none MD, for example. So we'll say once we get to a medium sized screen, we'll just remove this item. So we go and create a media query. We say add media screen and max width is equal to maybe 1024 pixels, and we'll say that then we are going to set dot display none to display of none, and before it's obviously display block. So this is our page. Let's shrink the page, let's shrink it, and now as you can see it has been removed. And one more thing, as you can see our footer looks terrible, so we will just give our footer a class of dot wrap, and we'll say flex wrap is basically wrap. Now we'll copy this class and use this class for all of our items inside of our footer. So we'll use wrap right here, and we will also use maybe class flex and wrap right here. And let's give this one a gap of maybe 1. And now once we shrink this window, basically the items should start to wrap. And as you can see, they essentially do. We could obviously also add a limited width to those items. So we could, for example, say .w minus 90, max width 90%. We're going to copy this line. We will give this line to our entire footer, essentially. So let's go down to the footer. We will use this class right here. And let's also, for those items, let's use justify center. We're going to shrink the screen again, as you can see, and now everything is centered and looks a lot better already. And as you can see, now we have this mobile-friendly sign-up form. But as you can see, it still looks terrible on a mobile device. And the reason for this is that we are still having a gap of 5 right here, even though we are using a small screen. So what I can do is I can say, obviously this is like really a bad way to do it, but I'm just going to show you that I'm just going to remove gap 5 on mobile screen because we only used it once right here, and I will say gap is 0 once we get to this width, and now our item is basically centered. But obviously, usually you should use a proper way of doing this. But as you can see now, we have this effect and everything looks good on pretty much every single device.